Hey, everybody. I'm Jared Thurmon. I live just north of Atlanta, Georgia, just south of Chattanooga. And we got us some farm animals out here, and we have us a good time. And I'm the pastor of the local Adventist church. So I'm honored to be interviewing and moderating two guys tonight that I would consider, especially as in recent weeks, listening to you guys. I don't know many people that know more about Adventists and the race discussion in America than you guys. And I also would probably say that no one knows more about the solutions to this than you guys. So I'm excited to hear from you. Let me start with you, Kevin. Kevin Burton is an instructor in the History and Political Studies Department at Southern Adventist University. And Kevin, you told me you're writing your PhD, I guess your dissertation is on the Millerites and Seventh-day Adventists' involvement in the abolition movement. So that sounds pretty awesome. So welcome, Kevin. And
Thank
Dr.
you.
Benjamin Baker teaches history, religion, writing, and I'm going to add one more thing in there, Ben. He has put together the most intense compilation of Ellen White's writings I've ever seen. I think, Kevin, you acknowledged it's the most comprehensive. And Ben, I think you said it is the most comprehensive, 1,400 and something pages. But it is on everything to do with Black history and Adventism, and I think some very pertinent things that deal with race in America, which I'm extremely passionate about, more so than ever. So, guys, if you're ready, let's jump in. And I think, Kevin, you're going to start us off. And as soon as you guys share some things, Kevin, you go first. Then, Ben, I'm going to turn it to you. And then I know I'm going to have some questions, and we're going to start running. So take it away.
All right, sounds good. So we've got just a few minutes here. And I want to make a thesis statement for you guys. This is what I'm going to give you in about 10 minutes. I want you to understand that Seventh-day Adventism and the Adventist movement more broadly, not just Seventh-day Adventism, but the Great Second Advent movement, as J.N. Loughborough called it, and that includes Millerism and Seventh-day Adventism. It is inseparable from the abolitionist movement. And so that's kind of a major statement to make, but it's true. And I'm prepared to defend that. And I'll give you some little bits here and there on that. The other thing I want to make, the other point I want to make is that the issues of religion and politics are inseparable. And that's the way it was in the 19th century. And Adventists understood that. And as a result of this, they fought against racism through both religious and political tactics. And so that's what I'm going to share with you guys. So let's start with William Miller. Father Miller, right? The Advent movement begins with him. And he starts to preach in 1831 in August, probably just as Nat Turner's rebellion was breaking out in the South. As Nat Turner and his compatriots were beginning to attack their slave owners in Virginia, William Miller was probably riding home after giving his first week of lectures in New York, in Dresden, New York. So that's sort of an odd pairing, but it almost heralded an interesting connection that would be made, not between slave revolts and Adventism, but between abolition and Adventism. And William Miller starts to publish his first stuff in 1832, and he's not an abolitionist at this time. But in the fall of 1833, he converted to abolitionism. And he publishes his first pamphlet just a few weeks after that. And what's fascinating is that from that moment, William Miller started to intentionally, at least at times, that doesn't mean all the time or 100% of the time, but he began to intentionally try to spread his theory of the apocalypse and the immediate advent, as he called it, through abolitionist networks. And so as soon as his pamphlet comes off the press in November 1833, about a week after the stars fell, that great Leonid meteor shower that happened on November 13, his pamphlets were published about a week later. And as soon as they come off the press, he boxes up a bunch of them or packages up a bunch of them, and he sends them off to the office of the Emancipator. And the Emancipator was an abolitionist newspaper published in New York City. Charles W. Dennison was the editor at the time, and Dennison becomes a Millerite. And he's one of many other abolitionists that will become a Millerite as well. And Denison will eventually hand over the editorialship to William Goodell, and things will go on. But nevertheless, they started to sell William Miller's pamphlet at the New York Emancipator's office. And so this is just a meager beginning of how Miller himself is intentionally using his abolitionist networks to try to spread his theory, and that will just continue to grow and grow and grow. Henry Jones is a name that most people don't know unless they're experts on Adventist history and Millerite history in particular. And I'm making a new argument in my dissertation and subsequent book that he was the co-founder of Millerism. We have actually, I think, got it a little bit wrong that we've just said, it's all William Miller, all William Miller. No, when you look at Henry Jones, you see that William Miller gets ideas and changes some aspects of his theory through the influence of Henry Jones in particular. Henry Jones was the major proponent that causes Miller himself to become an abolitionist. And he also is massively involved in networking. And so he is going to help bring in, I don't know how to quantify it, but roughly half. Miller brings in about half of the people, and Jones brings in about the other half. And then Joshua Himes brings them all together into a massive conversation, and they start to really, really spread Millerism. But Henry Jones is also intentionally using abolition to spread Millerism. He's one of the founders of the Vermont Anti-Slavery Society. And there was at least 20 other people that I know by name. There's a little over 20 that I know by name who become Millerites of that anti-slavery society alone. But then you move on to Joshua Himes, who is really the architect in many ways of Millerism. You might even want to call him a third co-founder, because it wouldn't have existed without him. The Millerite movement would have just died in obscurity, really, without Himes. And whenever he gets on board in late 1839, he also intentionally uses his abolitionist network to spread Millerism. And so he brings William Lloyd Garrison on board, and William Lloyd Garrison is going to advertise William Miller's lectures in the Liberator, the most famous and influential anti-slavery abolitionist newspaper. He's also going to have the Signs of the Times, which is the first Millerite paper. He has that advertised in the Liberator as well for 4 weeks in a row. And that paper, I should tell you a little bit more about it. The Signs of the Times was actually published by abolitionists. So two abolitionists, Moses Dow and Francis Jackson, they approach Joshua Himes and they tell him, we will agree to publish this paper, taking all of the financial burden on ourselves and the risk if it failed, if you will edit the paper for free. And so Himes agrees to do so. And for the first year, that's how it functioned. And then Himes bought out, after a year, he bought out their interest, and then Dow and Jackson continued as the printer for the Signs of the Times. Well, Dow and Jackson, their office was the office that had been the office of Isaac Knapp. And as it turns out, Isaac Knapp was the publisher for William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. And so when that started to be published years earlier in 1831, Isaac Knapp was the one publishing it. And so the point here is that the same exact publisher and press that launched the abolitionist movement in 1831 is the same one that launches the Millerite movement in 1839 and 40. And that office of Dow and Jackson continues to be the headquarters of the Millerite movement. And so the Second Advent Depot is there, and that means that all of the Adventist, the Millerite print, is being filtered through that office and being mailed out everywhere in America. They also had a Second Advent reading room in that office, in an abolitionist office. And so everyone in Boston is coming there and they're reading Millerite, material, Millerite Adventist material, and talking about all these things. And this is happening in abolitionist space. And so the point is that the abolitionists and Millerite shared space. And I could tell you more examples of that because there was actually quite a few. There also was intentional effort to include Black Adventists, Black Millerites, and Seventh-day Adventists. And so you see Black Millerite preachers, you see Black Seventh-day Adventist ministers, and you see that they did not segregate their churches and their meetings. And in fact, this is one of the things that makes people in the North really upset at the Millerites and hate them. You can see, Ben and I have found articles where editors and people even in the North are ridiculing Millerism because they are mixing races and they are not segregating. And they're actually maybe even touching bodies whenever they, at the end of their meetings, they hold hands and they sing their hymns. And so this is really critical. And so the politics of inclusion is important because almost everyone in the North at this time is so racist that they will not even walk down the same side of the sidewalk with a black person if they're white. And so that's critical. And there were lots of laws that they had in place to make that stick and make it impactful. And so one of the ways that Adventists fought against this is they fought through political tactics. And so in addition to many who were voting, particularly for the Liberty Party, which was an abolitionist party, you had many Adventists who were signing and circulating petitions. And so Joseph Bates, one of our church founders, I mean, he's really actually the first because he brings the Sabbath and sanctuary doctrines together. He brings James and Ellen White into the movement and all this kind of stuff. He is circulating, not just signing, but circulating numerous petitions to both the Massachusetts state legislature and to the House of Representatives and Congress at the nation's capital. And so he's very involved in this. His wife is involved in this too. And some of these petitions are really, really radical. I mean, they're all actually radical, but some of them are even more so because you'll see Joseph Bates is able to get like 80 signatures for trying to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. And then he only got like 20 signatures when he's trying to abolish Massachusetts interracial marriage law that says a white person and black person cannot intermarry. And so Joseph Bates was one of the most radical of radical abolitionists because he's actually fighting against that issue, which is probably the most sensitive issue on the issue of race is interracial marriage, or definitely one of them. And so Joseph Bates is actually playing a role there. And amazingly enough, he and other Adventists play a role in actually getting that law abolished in Massachusetts in 1843 because they're petitioning for that. He's just one of several, but like nevertheless, we had a role, our pioneers had a role in getting that abolished. And they were not just wanting to abolish interracial marriage law, they were also going for every kind of law in the state of Massachusetts that distinguished upon the basis of color. So Jim Crow cars on the trains where black people had to ride in segregated cars, Joseph Bates is trying to get rid of that law too. And in 1843, again, the railroad companies agree to abolish the Jim Crow cars. And so we had a role to play in the successful overthrow of those laws of segregation as well. But Adventists also, Seventh-day Adventists in particular, also used religious tactics to fight against this. And I've argued this elsewhere, and I could go into a lot more detail, but I'm going to give you in a nutshell how we worked it into our fundamental beliefs, the three angels' messages. First angel in Revelation 14 says, the hour of God's judgment has come. Adventists consistently said from the Millerite period through the Seventh-day Adventist years that slaveholders and pro-slavery people are going to be condemned in the judgment. So you have to change your ways. And if you do not change your ways on earth before God comes, you are going to be lost. And so that's crucial. That means you must change now on earth. And so they did that. Second angel's message. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. They connect it with Revelation 18. Come out of her, my people. And one of the sins that Babylon engages in is trafficking in slaves in the souls of men. Revelation 18:13. And one of the main reasons, in fact, I think probably the primary reason, and that means just the first, not like the most important perhaps, but definitely the first issue, why Millerites came out of their evangelical churches in the 1840s is because the evangelicals supported slavery. And so that issue gets dovetailed in with their rejection of the Advent doctrine, and Adventist Millerites come out of those churches for that reason. And they insist on staying out. And so Ellen White insists that any pro-slavery Adventists, and there were very few, we know one by name, she says they must be disfellowshipped. And so we have to not only come out, but we have to stay out of Babylon. And then finally, the third angel's message, I'll say this in just 30 seconds because my time is up. They insisted that America was this two-horned beast of Revelation 13. It looked like a lamb because it has a horn that represents civil liberty and religious liberty, but it spoke like a dragon because it denied civil and religious liberty to religious and racial minorities. And so Adventists used that doctrine of Revelation 13 of the two-horned beast to consistently preach against slavery and racism in the North. That is all I've got time to say right now, but we'll get more to the Q&A.
Kevin, I think we're going to film a documentary. I've been building it in my mind as you've been telling. Ben, let's keep it going. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
I think you're muted, Ben.
Let's make sure.
No.
Please, audience, attendees, please invite your friends in. Let's have a discussion. Let's talk. Ask us anything, and we will field it. But please bring more people in, because our message is vital. And I want to talk about Ellen White, because she is the co-founder and prophet of our church. Her 87 years of life were critical for the fledgling republic that was the United States of America, and equally for African Americans, whose population in those 9 decades grew from 2 million in 1827 to 10 million in 1915. This period saw the institution of slavery at its strongest and most ingrained, a costly and ruinous war that jeopardized the existence of America, the extinction of slavery and the emancipation of millions of blacks, and the volatile subsequent decades in which African Americans were variously assimilated into free society, systematically oppressed in new ways, sometimes re-enslaved, and the migration of large numbers of blacks to the North for a better life. So the question is, how did Ellen White relate to blacks throughout her life? How did Ellen White relate to blacks throughout her life in this critical period of black people's American sojourn? Well, for most of her life, Ellen White lived hundreds of miles away from any significant number of blacks. Very important. She lived hundreds of miles away from any significant number of blacks. Ellen, and if you all will please allow me to call her Ellen, as I don't want to keep referring to her as white when we are talking about blacks. Maybe you'll get that 10 minutes later and laugh 10 minutes later. Ellen was born in Maine, and that's about as far away from the South as you could be at the time in the United States. Remember that California and other parts of the West were not a part of the US at the time. Intriguingly though, Maine was admitted as a state 7 years after Ellen White was born in order to balance out the voting power of slave and free states. When Ellen was 9, her life was upended when she was hit in the face with a stone. In short, this act of violence resulted in her face being permanently altered, her having to essentially drop out of school, and the dashing of her ambitions for life. As she said, I greatly wanted to be a scholar, but then I couldn't. But from this traumatic aftermath, Ellen began her Christian conversion process, developed an unusual sensitivity to the plight of suffering and the marginalized by experiencing it firsthand, and she gained a great appreciation for the education that she was now incapable of receiving. These developments would undergird her relationship to Black people throughout her life. Ellen White first saw a Black man model how to be faithful to the prophetic call. Her father took her on his sleigh to hear William Foy lecture, and Ellen sat right in front of the lectern when Foy spoke due to her respiratory problems. She said that it was remarkable testimonies that he bore, and she purchased his pamphlet of the visions. She spoke with him at length on one occasion, and she would later have their visions very similar to Foy's. And he would come hear her speak in support. Foy showed Ellen how to be faithful to the divine mandate to prophethood in antagonistic and even hostile societies, despite personal disadvantage. Foy defied deep misgivings about his race, age, and education, while Ellen was plagued by poor health, the wrong age, no education, gender, and her temperament. Ellen White married a young preacher named James Springer White, who, like her, was strongly opposed to slavery and would use the church's official paper to rail against the abominable institution. Ellen knew and supported the first Black minister of the church, named Ari Barr, and envisioned Saul that he was, quote, among men to be depended upon. She sat under Barr's preaching on several occasions. She also cultivated a friendship with another early Black minister, a former slave named John West, who Kevin has done research on. At a time when such a thing was verboten, James and Ellen White stayed at the houses of Black people, including Elias and Henrietta Platt, and James and Eliza Hardy, the latter of whom Ellen said she longed to have a better friendship with. After the Harper's Ferry raid, Ellen defended John Brown, who was being nationally excoriated, saying that his motives for the raid were, quote, all right. Based on a vision, Ellen instructed Adventists to not obey the Fugitive Slave Act, which required that citizens apprehend or report escaped slaves, even in free states. She told Adventists to suffer the consequences of disobeying this federal law. Ellen fearlessly and repeatedly condemned America's enslavement of Blacks based on the Bible, the U.S. Constitution, moral principles, and natural rights. She painstakingly detailed the evils of slavery and proclaimed that, quote, the whole system of slavery was originated by Satan, who delights in tyrannizing over human beings. Though he has been successful in degrading and corrupting the Black race, many are possessed of decided ability, and if they were blessed with opportunities, they would show more intelligence than do many of their more favored brethren among the white people, unquote. And Kevin, can you just mute your speaker? Thank you. Ellen demanded that all Adventists condemn slavery with her or else be disfellowshipped. She would charge that even though Adventists didn't own slaves per se, they were guilty for allowing slavery and profiting from it. She said these things in record, in print, so she was not shy or coy about saying them. Some of Ellen White's greatest predictive visions were on the Civil War, about God's retribution on a nation that had so mistreated Blacks. She stated on numerous occasions that the Confederacy, or the Southern cause, originated with Satan and was led by him. She also revealed that God protracted the Civil War so that there would be more casualties, and thus carried out his vengeance against the nation. These visions helped establish Ellen White as a prophet in this movement. Ellen insisted on the full humanity of Blacks and their equality with whites when scientific racism and the curse of Ham trope prevailed, and even many Christians did not believe that Blacks were human. When Blacks were finally emancipated in 1865, Ellen stated unequivocally that God freed them just as he had freed the Hebrews from Egypt in the Exodus. Ellen played a part in bringing Charles M. Kinney into the faith when she preached in an evangelistic effort in Reno, Nevada. She followed his ministry, and in 1889, when Charles Kinney brought new blacks into the all-white St. Louis Adventist church, and the white Adventists there treated them so reprehensively because of their race. Ellen White had a vision on race in which God told her that sin rested on the Seventh-day Adventist church because of their racism and lack of concern for blacks. In 1891, Ellen shared the contents of the 1889 vision with GC church leaders and preached to them the full equality of the races. She likened the incarnate Jesus to blacks in the South and said that the church was guilty of neglecting Jesus himself in the form of blacks. Ellen's son, Edson, and her daughter-in-law, Emma, decided to risk their lives to preach the gospel to blacks in Mississippi. Emma would contract malaria while in the Deep South and would eventually die from its complications. Edson's Southern Missionary Society is often credited with laying the foundation for the black work. This is Ellen's son. Ellen called for Adventists to give reparations for slavery with what Adventists could do at the time. They didn't have much money. Free education, health care, and preaching the gospel. Those were the reparations Ellen White said Adventists should give. Ellen had countless visions about blacks in which she saw Jesus himself urging the church to go south and help them. She personally cajoled her friends, family, GC presidents, church leaders to do more for the black work. In fact, when Ellen White was speaking about black people, that was one of the first times she said that the GC, the General Conference, was no longer the voice of God. When she talked about how they had finagled the black funds. Ellen herself raised thousands of dollars for black evangelism and education, and personally subsidized black ministers who were struggling financially. She upbraided church leaders when the monies raised for blacks, like in the self-denial box campaign, were diverted to the evangelization of whites, calling it fraud and embezzlement. When Ellen did counsel Adventists to observe the color line or racial segregation, it was in order to reach blacks and whites with the gospel, a goal she considered paramount. Ellen's visions helped to establish the Adventist movement in Africa. In the Great Controversy, she lifted up the people of Ethiopia as preservers of the true Seventh-day Sabbath when all of Europe was in darkness. Ellen wrote hundreds of pages in support of Oakwood, Adventism Soul HBCU, of which she had numerous visions, and she said that the students of Oakwood would play a part in the gospel proclamation of the last days. She spoke at numerous black churches and had personal friendships with many blacks. She predicted future race wars and urged Adventists to do their part to avert those wars. She saw the eschatological promise of blacks and wrote, therefore, that, quote, "The powers of hell are working with all their ingenuity to prevent the proclamation of the last message of mercy among the colored people," end quote. In clause 6 of her last will and testament, Ellen specified that proceeds from her books should go to the black work, so that even in her death, she would be assisting black people. In sum, Ellen White spent a good portion of her prophetic ministry in activism for blacks. She never, ever saw racial justice as a political issue. For her, it was deeply spiritual, religious, and moral in nature. She did all in her power to right the racial wrongs that had been done by white Americans to blacks.
where that takes us. But no, thank you guys. It's so informative. Seeing the comments here on the right side, I think everybody feels like it's eye opening. So thank you. Why don't we just start to come to some questions? If people have questions, I'd try to keep back to those. So rich for what you guys shared. So many things that I did not know. And so I'm really grateful for that. I hate to leave off that high note into some questions that may take us into places that really may not be warranted, but these are questions, so let's talk about them. Let's go to this one. Were the Adventist pioneers' abolitionism based on the Bible? What were their foundational verses, if so? Kevin, you want to hit on that one?
Was based upon Scripture, absolutely. Seventh-day Adventists and the Millerites before them were convinced that the Bible condemns slavery. And that is an important statement to make, because most scholars today are going to tell you that the Bible does not condemn slavery. I think that's a little bit disingenuous. I think the most correct way to answer that question for us today is that there are statements in the Bible that don't condemn slavery, but there are statements in the Bible that do condemn slavery. And so some of the foundational texts that they used, Deuteronomy 23, verses 15 and 16, specifies that if a slave runs away from their master, they should have their freedom. And they should be allowed to live wherever they choose, even within your gate, and you should not oppress them. That's a rough paraphrase of that passage. And Adventist said that is God's fugitive slave law. So when America passes a fugitive slave law or revises the fugitive slave, there was one in 1793, but whenever they revised that in 1850, Adventists say that is a direct violation of the laws of God, which is why Ellen White, and she's not alone, Adventists across the board are saying we are duty bound to break the fugitive slave law, and there were many that did, and that assisted slaves on the Underground Railroad. They also used another one that I briefly mentioned is Revelation. Revelation 18 clearly condemns slavery. It's something that Babylon does. Babylon is engaging in selling bodies and people. So this is a direct violation, and so they used that very strongly and tied that in with all of their understanding of the end times. And so those are some of the most important. They also used the passages that say we are all of one blood. I think that comes from Paul. It might be in Acts, I'm not sure. They also used, James White uses, for example, Isaiah, I don't remember the exact chapter, where talking about the day of liberation, the oppressed shall go free, etc. He uses that passage and ties it in with the Sabbath, and so forth. And there's several others. There's neither Jew nor Greek, male or female, slave nor free. That's from Galatians. They use that passage as well. If you look at a book that talks about abolitionism and their use of the Bible, there are a few that I could recommend if you want to read more. The only thing that Adventists really do that's unique is Revelation 18, and tying that in with Revelation 13. Some other people are talking about that a little bit, but that's kind of our corner. And so that's a neat thing. I mean, yeah. So that's probably a good enough answer.
That's solid.
We can
that's
move on to
solid.
another
Thank
question.
you for that. Ben, see if you can take this one. Comment on why the church has taken a more social conservative approach to dealing with race relations post Ellen White's day.
I would answer it a couple of ways. Number one, whenever you become organized, there becomes a party line, and people tend to fall in line. The greatest activism was before organization. And this is when individuals were thinking for themselves, and they could write into the review and persuade others of their thoughts. And that's exactly what they did. With organization of the church, there eventually became a respectability. And this is a huge motif in Adventist history. And Kevin has spoken on this with our prophecy and other things. We became respectable. And at one time, we even became real Christians. It's, hey, we're real Christians now. And the evangelicals acknowledge us as real Christians. Isn't that great? And with that respectability, we didn't want to speak out against America anymore.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't want to speak out against other churches. Even now, we don't call other churches Babylon. I hear that very rarely.
Mm-hmm.
And so this respectability, because we were liked and we were accepted, then we changed. Whereas before, Joseph Bates was like, this slave-holding, neighbor-murdering, he was just going off on America, and the others were as well. And Kevin has spoken about how the FBI became interested in us because of this, because of our anti-American sentiments.
Mm-hmm.
A third way that we became tame and tepid in our social statements, social justice statements, is the Southern expansion of the church. Post-emancipation, post-1865, slowly but steadily, Southerners started becoming Adventists. And this is not casting any aspersions on Southerners, but they came in with certain ideas about race. And those ideas about race became calcified and literally became systemic. I mean, literally became systemic. We had the Negro Department, the General Conference in the Kilgore years and the Kilgore Principle. They were making resolutions on observing the color line, on being segregated in worship services. So it literally became systematic, and Adventists became organizationally racist. So that Southern expansion was another huge thing. And also, Kevin can speak more eloquently about this than I can, but the conservative push and the religious right movement of the 60s and 70s pretty much did us in for good. With that movement and the religious right, civil rights, as today, because the question was already asked about the Black Lives Movement. As today, the civil rights movement was viewed as communist, Marxist, socialist. It was viewed as, blacks wanting to be equal with whites and interracial marriage and all of these things. And so Adventists who had glommed on to the conservative movement, not really the early part with Billy Graham and, starting then, but sort of in the 60s and 70s, they became Republican conservative. And they did not speak out on racial issues as they once did. Check out the book, Seeking the Sanctuary. Is that it? Seeking the Sanctuary. And also Doug Morgan's book, Adventism and the American Republic. Mm-hmm. And even Millennial Dreams. These books talk about how Adventists became simpatico with the conservative movement. And as a result, Jared, there was not even a fumbling of the ball. There was a route, just to continue the football analogy. Right. There was a route like 1,000 to 0. Adventists have the 0 because we became like the 61st out of 67 churches to integrate our schools. And an Adventist minister had to call, the Southern Union and say, it's now law that you integrate your schools. Hello. This is in the 60s. You can read about this in Samuel London's book, Seventh-day Adventists and the Civil Rights Movement. So we became way behind. And so I would say that it was because of those factors.
Kevin, you want to chime in a little bit on that? Anything to do with that conservative movement? Okay.
Simply say that we need to do more work on this exact question. Historians do. And so it's unfortunately, historical research takes a long time. So hopefully within the next 10 years, we'll have something really solid, even more solid, that is in print on this.
All right. Yeah, that's great. All right, let's go to another one here. Many people say that we shouldn't join the Black Lives Matter movement because they are linked to Marxism. So let's just touch on this. I think a few have this thought. Ben, you just touched on it a little bit, but let's flesh it out a little more. Kevin, you want to start us?
I can start.
All right, Ben, you got it. Go for it.
Yeah. The Black Lives Movement started as a slogan with the brutal killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. So originally it was literally a slogan on a sign, on a protest sign. Because all protests movements want to follow up with some sort of organization to actually get things into law and to actually make things happen, an organization developed called Black Lives Matter. And that's the organization. To this day, there's a difference between the organization and the slogan. Like, people are saying that when Andrews University said Black Lives Matter, that they were leaguing with the organization. No, they were repeating the slogan. And that's a very important distinction, because you are right. Black Lives Matter now has a platform, and you can read about it on their website, that Adventists may disagree with. Many points on it Adventists may disagree with. Now, Kevin can speak on Ellen White and the WTC, and as to if we necessarily disagree with the movement, does that mean that we shouldn't join it at all, even in its good goals, which is to stop police brutality and to save Black lives? However, they are right that one of the leaders, at least, of the Black Lives Matter movement does summon the ancestors, namely those who were murdered by police brutality, such as Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, and others, before they began marching. But let me add a couple of things. This does mean that you won't be in any movement that has other Protestants in it, because they are also spiritualists. We call them, because they believe different things about us in the state of the dead. So that means that let's not be racial about this, because I feel that all of a sudden with Black Lives Matter movement, we can't be involved in this because those are spiritualists. But we've always called Catholics, all the other Protestants, we call them spiritualists. So don't be involved in anything with them. In fact, don't even go to work if they're there. Obviously, I'm being facetious, but come on now, let's be consistent, okay? Also, I would say this: if you have a problem with Black Lives Matter movement, then start your own movement. And good on this. Start your own movement that is anti-racism against Blacks and anti-police brutality. Start a movement and have an Adventist perspective to that movement. Kevin has called for an Adventist politic. And I believe that we as Adventists have a special last day message. We are people of prophecy. And when we protest and when we riot against something, that it will have a prophetic flavor that others will not have, and that we will do activism in a different way than others. I actually believe that, because we are a people of prophecy. So let's start our own groups, grounded in Adventism, grounded in the Three Angels' messages, that protest these things, but with our own flavor and our own spin. Please, let's do that.
Yeah, that's solid. Kevin, you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, sure, I will. So this is a good question. Then I can talk about the WCTU, but I can also talk about the abolition movement more, because most people don't really understand what the abolitionist movement was. This was a very broad and diverse movement. If you want to talk about things that Adventists disagree with, let's talk about the abolitionist movement. There were spiritualists in that, like all over the place, that are having conversations with dead spirits and all sorts of things that Adventists are against. There were communists. There were numerous people in the abolitionist movement who were in utopian societies, and they were sharing property, they were sharing money, they were sharing everything. There was also deviant sexual practices. John Humphrey Noyes, who is very influential, and William Lloyd Garrison himself, he started the Oneida Community. And the Oneida Community had some very outlandish sexual practices. I'll just mention them to you. This is going to be a little bit racy for a second. They practiced male continence, which meant that men were not supposed to ejaculate whenever they're having sex. So they were supposed to have sex with a woman up until before they ejaculate, and then they were supposed to stop before the orgasm. Okay, and so in Oneida, they actually specified that you had to train for this. And so older women would train adolescent boys in how to do this. And older men would train adolescent girls in how to do this. So if you want to talk about deviant sexual practices, boy, they're in the abolitionist movement. So I could go on and I could go on and I can go on. And this did not prevent Seventh-day Adventists from being involved in speaking out against racism and slavery. Okay. Now, going back to, now, I want to make it clear here, Seventh-day Adventists were against these things I've been sharing, okay? But they carved out their own ways to do these things, and they also participated in some of the ways that everyone else is doing, like voting and petitioning and other things like that. And so the point is, and perhaps it's the clearest with Ellen White in the temperance movement, is that when Adventists have common cause, Ellen White said for the temperance work, she says it's okay for us to support the WCTU because we have common cause with them. And this is a major thing for her to say, because the WCTU is advocating for a national Sunday law. They're actually advocating for a national Sunday law. But Ellen White says because we agree on the temperance issue, we should support it. And Ellen White did herself. She spoke to some of the largest crowds in her life, one time to 20,000 people for the WCTU on temperance. And then she actually tells Adventists, she says, I'm gonna make some of you uncomfortable here. This is a loose paraphrase. She says, I'm gonna make some of you uncomfortable here and tell you that you should vote even on the Sabbath if you have to for this kind of justice. And so you should be cautious. Absolutely. Like whenever you get involved with other people like that don't believe things that you do, you need to be careful. So use some common sense, uphold your faith, and don't compromise your beliefs. But remember, common cause, we have common cause with people on lots of different things. And so we actually do support, like we work with evangelicals sometimes on evolution stuff, you know, and we work with other Christians on when it comes to religious liberty issues. You know, and we've worked with Catholics, we've worked with Jehovah's Witnesses. I could go on and on and on. And so let's be consistent, like Ben says, and let's not throw the politics card just because race is now involved. We're playing double, and we have consistently played double on that for decades, and it really needs to stop. So I really do think. Last thing I'll say, Jared, is I really do think that we have dropped the ball because we have the Religious Liberty Department at the GC. But because of our doctrine of the two-horned beast, when we specify that those horns represent civil and religious liberty, we have dropped the ball because we have never had a civil liberty department. And so really what I think that we need to do as a church is combine that with the Religious Liberties Department and put them in one and change the name, change the format of the organization, or create a new department so that we are actually staying consistent with our own beliefs, with our own prophecies. So that would solve a lot of these issues. If we had a civil liberties department, then we would have a platform already in place to speak out on these issues in America today and around the world. All right.
Amen. No, that's solid. Hey, so we've got about 10 minutes, and I want to tackle this next one. I think each of you will have some comments on this. So whoever wants to go first, here's the question. Is there a way for the Adventist Church to merge the state conferences and regional conferences? If so, how? If not, why not?
Start. You go ahead.
Yeah, I have seen a lot of calls for that to be done, but I haven't seen a feasible plan. I will just speak to the history of it and say that regional,
because I want to hear your opinions. So just because of our time, be quick with that. Then your opinion.
Regional conferences have made American Adventism. They have made American Adventism. The current NAD president, Alex Bryant, is a product of regional conferences. For years, for decades, they were the only ones in the church. I'm being a little bit hyperbolic, but bringing souls in, winning people and really powering the evangelism of the church. Without them, I don't think that there would even be the African expansion of Adventism. And right now there are almost 9.5 million Adventists in continental Africa. And they will soon become half of the church. Adventists in Africa will soon become 50% of the church. It's only a matter of time. And so regional conferences, I never like to hear about them being demolished, because to me, they are the engine that keeps things running. Why not other conferences be demolished? Let others come to the regional conferences. I don't want to hear anything about them being demolished. I don't find anything wrong with mission particularity, because I know that if there's ever any sort of joining, that blacks will get the short end of the stick and they won't be evangelized, just like it was in the 30s and 40s. We're going to go back to the future on this one. And so that's my statement on it. And I challenge anybody to to challenge that.
All right, that's fair. Kevin.
My 2 bits on it. So some of you might be aware that it's been several weeks ago now that there was a petition circulated to go to the General Conference to abolish the regional conferences. I signed lots of petitions that deal with issues of race, and I chose not to sign that petition. And the reason I didn't sign that petition is because I didn't see anything clearly stated about how things were going to be integrated, how things were going to be resolved. And I am also concerned, like Ben, that a lot of Adventists are naively approaching this issue to where they are going to say, if we can abolish regional conferences, then we now can be free of racism in the church, or some such nonsense. And so what I want to see happen to build up my own faith, and I'm white, okay, as if that wasn't obvious. And so I want to have enough, I want to see evidence that we are actually ready to integrate. And yeah, why is it that we say abolish the regional conferences and not the other way around? That's a good point that Ben just raised. But I want us to not put the cart before the horse, is what I'm saying. I would like to see us, have just conferences, that would be great. But if we're not really ready for that, then we don't need to do it now. I hope that we can be ready to do that very, very soon. And so I'm very active and would love to be part of thinking of ways that we can make this happen. But we've really got to deal with the issue, which is in the pews, I think, before we can get to the other part. All right, Ben, correct me. What did I get wrong?
Just another word very quickly, Jared. 2 things. Number one, the conferences are no longer racially stratified as they once were. In regional conferences, of course, you have Hispanics, you have Asians, you have white churches, and vice versa in the other conferences. Now, this is my challenge to people who are saying that regional conferences should be abolished and the conferences should be joined. Why don't you move your church to regional conferences, to a regional conference, as a bright and shining example of racial integration? So if you go to a white church, go ahead and take it out of the state conference and move it to regional conferences and pay your tithe there and all that good stuff as an example of racial unity and harmony. Okay? And this goes out to pastors like Dwight Nelson and others who are making these calls to join the conference. Take Pioneer Memorial Church and join Lake Region Conference. Come on now, let's put our money where our mouth is. Okay, so let's do our own integration. Let's stop thinking about only appealing to the powers that be. And I have great respect for Pastor Nelson, and I'm singling him out because he's been calling for regional conferences regularly. So let's go ahead and move PMC to Lake Region.
I like that. Action step. All right. Any closing thoughts? Kevin, Ben?
I love you all. It's been a blessing being here, and hope to see you in person. Please send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat, and let's talk.
All right. Kevin, any last thoughts?
My heart is for our church. I love our church, and I'd like to see us continue to grow. What I would like to see happen is that we can strongly state and practice a belief that racism is a sin. Racism is a sin that can keep you from eternity. And we need to be able to be more clear about what racism is. And so I encourage everyone to read more, to understand issues. There is a real problem with race relations in America. There has been from the get-go, because we brought slaves pretty much from the very beginning. And so it's deeply, deeply entrenched. This is not some sort of plot. I've heard so many conspiracy theories, people saying it was Hamas, trying to incite a race war, or the communists, such nonsense. Please do not blame somebody else for our problem. Okay, we have a problem in America. We have a problem in our church. Let's deal with it. Let's embrace the fact that we are the most racially diverse religion in America. And let's lead by example. Let's show the world what it really means to believe that we are going to speak to every nation, tribe, language, and people, and to be of the community that is going to be living in heaven. So let's do that. So I just want to encourage us all to keep studying, keep learning, keep dialoguing, asking questions, and find some way to get involved yourself.
Thank you, guys. That was rich. I'm extremely blessed, and we got to talk about that documentary. So, hey, I know we got to close up. There is a challenge coming up by Chris. So everybody don't sign off yet. We're going to turn that over. We're going to turn our cameras off and they're going to come on. But to Kevin and Ben, I really appreciate you guys. Very genuine discussion. I'm very enlightened. So if it was just for me, I'm fired up and I got my money's worth. So thank you guys.
Thank you.